Greetings, family. My name is Dr. Chike Akua, and I'm very pleased to be with you today to share a message on the topic of reparations in education. A plan for the demand. Again, reparations in education, a plan for the demand. Certainly a topic as timely as this is very important that we discuss so that we can understand the demands that we need to make to provide for ourselves, our community, and the future of our people. I want to first begin by giving a very, very special thank you to the Auburn Avenue Research Library, and in particular to Brother Morris Gardner, who's been very supportive of my work as an African-centered educator and historian. I also want to bring you greetings from Clark Atlanta University, where I am very blessed to serve in the School of Education in the Department of Educational Leadership. I bring you greetings from the Teacher Transformation Institute, where we use standards-based, research-driven, African-centered and culturally relevant instructional strategies to increase student achievement. Now, those are just some big sounding words to say that our children are brilliant, but many of them are in schools and in school systems where they're seen as a problem rather than people. And so we go into schools and school systems and colleges and universities, and we teach teachers and leaders and professors how to bring out the brilliance in Black students. And we have a number of people on our teacher transformation team that assist us in that work, whether it's Kobe Wilkerson, also known as El Kobe the Wiz, who focuses on reading, writing, and math achievement. Tierica Berry, our social emotional learning specialist, and we have Ronnie Thomas as our STEM specialist. Over the past 14 years, I've had the opportunity to work with very, very diverse groups of teachers and leaders around the country. My first and primary focus and purpose was to reach those that teach and lead Black children. But I soon, very quickly found out that in order to get to those that teach and lead Black children, it would lead me out of our community, because a high percentage, as we'll see later on, of the teachers and leaders who work with Black students are not Black people. And so I have led workshops, training seminars, and even hosted conferences working with educators who teach Black children. Again, Black children is my focus. I spent 14 years as a public school teacher working primarily with the middle grades level. But as I mentioned, I've also had experiences at the elementary level and the high school level. And I currently serve as a college professor as well. But I'm constantly in and out of schools, working with schools, districts, and school leaders to increase Black student achievement and performance. I want to first begin, as is customary with African people, we want to begin by welcoming the presence and honoring, giving honor to the Most High, who is known by many names and worshiped in many ways. Certainly the one source and the one force through which we all live, move, and have our being. Ashe. We also give honor to our ancestors because there's an African proverb which says, if we stand tall, it is because we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, or as Dr. Jacob Carruthers has said, indeed our stride is wide because we're walking in the footsteps of giants. One of the giants in whose footsteps I'm attempting to walk and on whose shoulders I'm attempting to stand tall is none other than Nana Baforo Amankwechia II, known in the community oftentimes as Dr. Asa Hilliard III. And I made him a promise years ago, and that promise was that I would continue what he had begun. And this is a promise that I've made to many of our elders and African-centered scholars to carry on the work that they began and to do so with excellence. And so the prayer is that we're continuing to do just that. You've heard it said before that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but what I'm about to share with you, it's very important that you not only look with your two physical eyes, because this is a visually driven presentation with a lot of documentation, but you must also look with what our ancestors called the ujat, which is the third eye, the eye of all seeing enlightenment, that allows us to see beyond the physical into the mental and spiritual dimensions. Even as the great poet Lister Middleton said, sharpen your eye and tune your ear so you know what you see and understand what you hear. So that being said, let's go ahead and jump right in and get into it. The topic, once again, is reparations in education, a plan for the demand. And this is very interesting because there's a lot of talk about reparations. But in order to put forth a reparations claim, you must have a plan when you make the demand. You don't want to leave that plan into the hands of those that did you wrong, that are making you demand reparations in the first place. So we need a specific plan for the demand. This presentation that I'm going to share with you is not complete. It's not exhaustive, but it is some of my best thinking up to this point on the topic. There's a lot more research that needs to be done on it, but these are just preliminary plans for the demand. All right, that being said, we don't want to leave anything to chance. So first of all, what in the world is reparations? Reparations, according to NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, this is one of our oldest and steadfast organizations that's been advocating for reparations for almost 40 years now. But they define reparations as a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights by governments or corporations. So reparations is about repair and healing, repairing and healing and restoring the damage that was done as a result of grave human rights violations. And in order for us to understand the grave human rights violations, again, we don't want to leave that to chance because many people are not aware of the violations that were done against us. I do want to caution you though, reparations is very different from reform. One more time, reparations is very, very different from educational reform. Why? Reparations should not be confused with educational reform, principally because most often ed reform is reconstituted and reconstructed racism and inequity in the guise of progressive politics and policies. Let me break that down. That's quite a mouthful. Oftentimes when you hear issues of educational reform, all they've done is restructured it and reconfigured it, and the same inequities persist. But they put forth these different policies in the guise of progressive politics and policies to get people elected, or for certain people to gain favor, to make it look like something's being done when in reality, nothing has been done. That's why we still have the same persistent problems in education. So please don't confuse reparations with educational reform. Two very, very different things, all right? As a matter of fact, education should meet needs and solve problems, not create needs and solve problems. This is one of the challenges that we're dealing with today, because what's being called education seems to be causing more problems than it is solving, right? So with that in mind, why reparations in education? We know that reparations can and should take many forms. We're in need of reparations in terms of housing. We're in need of reparations in terms of healthcare. We're in need of reparations in terms of land and agriculture. There's so many different areas of reparations. Education would just be one of those areas. Economics would be another area. But it's my personal feeling that education is one of the best places to start. In addition to that, because I'm an educator and a professor of education, I want to stay in my lane and deal principally and primarily with what reparations would look like in education as we make this plan for the demand. So first of all, as it relates to education, it's very, very important to understand that prior to our enslavement, prior to the Ma'afa, the catastrophic interruption of African sovereignty and civilization, Black people led the world in educational excellence, scientific innovation, literary production, and wealth creation. We led the world, and the world came to sit at our feet and learn from our ancestors. However, because of the Ma'afa again, meaning the catastrophic interruption of African sovereignty and civilization. Maafa is a Swahili word that Marimba Ani has brought to us, and it means calamity, catastrophe, disaster. And that's what she uses to illuminate and help us to understand not just our enslavement. Enslavement is only one part of the Maafa. You've got forced displacement. You have rape, you have castration, you have family separation, you have Jim Crow laws, you have segregation, all these different things, because if you just say slavery, people relegate slavery from 1619 to 1865, but the Maafa is still going on. Very important that we understand that. So one of the things about the first thing that we need to look at, and I'm going to give you 7 things as a rationale as to why we need reparations in education. And the first one is forced ignorance and information suppression. Forced ignorance and information suppression. When we were captured as Africans and brought to the Americas and enslaved, we were placed in a system that forced ignorance upon us and suppressed information. Certain information for liberation was intentionally kept from us. And so we know, as James D. Anderson tells us in The Education of Blacks in the South, between 1800 and 1835, most of the Southern states enacted legislation making it a crime to teach enslaved children to read or write. But we also know that these things were not just in the South, this was all over America. And it was punishable by either mutilation or death. You could be whipped and beaten, you could have a finger cut off, you could have your hand cut off to make an example of other people. So we're talking about rampant white terrorism to ensure that Black people remained without critical information and without the means to educate themselves. So again, forced ignorance and information suppression by way of white terrorism. Number 2, the second reason why we make this claim for reparations in education is because of miseducation and diseducation. Dr. Carter G. Woodson gave us the book, The Miseducation of the Negro, in 1933, and he defined miseducation primarily as a process of omitting truthful cultural knowledge and not preparing students for life as they will face it. So in his review in this book, he talks about how Black people, even after emancipation, were not taught the truth about their history and culture, and how that information was left out of the history textbooks, was left out of all of the textbooks, and that information was intentionally omitted. So again, miseducation is the process of omitting truthful cultural knowledge and not preparing students for life as they will face it. Well, Mwalimu Mubaruti has also taught us that miseducation leads to diseducation. Well, what is diseducation? Diseducation is a process which leads the student to despise the very idea of learning. Think about that for just a second. Another way of saying that is, in other words, you've lied to me so much as a result of miseducation, now I don't want to learn anything. You ever seen this look on a child's face before? Where they're so disconnected and disenchanted with the schooling process, they act like they don't want to learn anything anymore. And so our second reason for making this demand for reparations in education is because of miseducation and diseducation. Thirdly, the third reason why we demand reparations in education is because of consistent inequitable funding and defunding of Black schools. Consistent inequitable funding and defunding of Black schools. Now, again, each of these are things that most of us already know, but I want to be very specific and I want to be very particular. I want to point to the research literature on this because we may need to educate other people on this. You, as an individual, may need to educate other people on this. We know that during the 90s, Jonathan Kozol came out with a book called Savage Inequalities that meticulously documented how school funding in Black communities was millions of dollars less than what other communities were getting, especially white communities. This did not come as a shock to Black people, but again, he put specific numbers to it, which added a bit more, gained a bit more attention. We know most recently, Eve Ewing has written a book called Ghosts in the Schoolyard, which talks about racism and school closings on Chicago's South Side. We know about Shani Robinson's book, None of the Above, the untold story of the Atlanta public schools cheating scandal, corporate greed. And here's what I really want you to get: the corporate greed and the criminalization of educators. There was so much more behind that than the notion that Black teachers were cheating for Black students. The idea here is that there's been consistent inequitable funding and defunding of Black schools, which is really interesting, because when you talk about, when you hear a lot of talk now about defunding the police, and people, feel some kind of way about that and have a lot of negative opinions about that. But the same people typically don't have the same angst, or don't have the same set of opinions when Black schools are constantly being defunded and have been defunded over the years. Let's take a look at this New York Times article, which reported finding that there was a $23 billion racial funding gap for schools. Now, this article came out in February of 2019. Says overwhelmingly, white school districts received $23 billion more than predominantly non-white school districts in state and local funding in 2016, despite serving roughly the same number of children, a new report finds. The funding gap is largely the result of the reliance on property taxes as a primary source of funding for schools. So in order to make a claim for reparations in education, we have to look at these funding formulas for how resources are dispensed. But again, the key is that there has been consistent inequitable funding and defunding of Black schools. This report was studying 2016, and this article came out in 2019. But we know that for decades and for centuries, this has been going on. Reason number 4, why we demand reparations in education: forced and intentional Black teacher and leader shortages. Forced and intentional Black teacher and leader shortages. We know that there is an overall teacher shortage in America today. But what many people may not realize is that the teacher shortage, particularly amongst Black people, was a forced and intentional teacher shortage. Again, let's go to the research literature. Michael Fultz tells us out of Wisconsin that as a result of the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education desegregation decision, over 39,000 Black teachers and leaders were displaced, demoted, and or just out and out fired from their teaching and leadership positions. Now, let me explain what that means. They were either demoted. So you may have a principal that was demoted to assistant principal, sent to a white school where a few Black students would be supposedly integrated into it. But that highly successful Black principal being demoted to assistant principal had no power. They would not be in any decision-making capacity. You had Black teachers who were demoted as well. They were made to teach outside of their area of expertise or outside of their subject matter and discipline expertise. And then you had some who were just out and out fired, who were not rehired. So over 39,000 lost their teaching and leadership positions. What's the cumulative effect of this forced teacher and leader shortage when the Brown versus Board of Education decision was supposed to help Black students? Some scholars have argued that it wasn't integration, it was disintegration of Black schools. Let's go a little bit further and look at what's going on with the cultural and demographic mismatch today. So for example, today over 90% of urban school teachers are white. 90%. When you drill down further from the urban areas deep into the inner city, 73% of teachers are white. Nearly 70% of inner city school principals are white. Almost 40% of American public schools do not have a single teacher of color on staff, and nearly 80% have no administrator of color. There is no reason why these things would exist unless there was a forced teacher and leader shortage. And these things are very important. I even came across an article yesterday from the National Bureau of Economic Research that tells us that Black students who have at least one Black teacher in elementary school are more likely to graduate from high school and more likely to enroll in college. All right. But let's go a little bit further, because we asked the question, does having an African-American educator impact African-Americans students' school success? Fewer African-American students are placed in special education classes when they have a Black teacher. When Black children have Black teachers, fewer Black students are suspended or expelled. When Black students have Black teachers, more Black students are placed in gifted and talented programs. And more Black students graduate from high school in 4 years. This comes from the research of Leslie Fenwick, who's the former dean of the School of Education at Howard University. And I was fortunate to assist on that as a graduate student. And so there are some people who find what's going on in schools today as it relates to our children, we're oftentimes described as being unreachable and unteachable. But I like to say those who say our children can't be reached have never seen a master teacher teach. One more time, those who say our children can't be reached have never seen a master teacher teach. You could take the same students who are failing, the same students who are getting suspended, the same students who are getting into fights, the same students who are disrespectful or belligerent. You can take those same students, put them in a classroom with a master teacher, and get a completely different result. I've seen it happen time and time again. I've seen it happen over and over again. As a matter of fact, in my teaching career, I was that teacher that those kinds of students were sent to. And I was able to get some outstanding results from many of them. So those who say our children can't be reached have never seen a master teacher teach. But we need to increase the Black teacher leader pipeline in order for that to change. And this is one of the demands that we make for reparations in education. Number 5, for the reason why we demand reparations in education: curriculum violence and cultural identity theft. Curriculum violence and cultural identity theft. Ighodaro and Wiggin have a book called Curriculum Violence, America's New Civil Rights Issue. And what they say is that when Black people are left out of the curriculum and inaccurately portrayed in the curriculum, that it does violence to the mind and the mentality of Black children, and really all children, but we're focused on Black children now. This curriculum violence is a problem because of the way Black people are characterized and mischaracterized in school curricula. It leads to what I've called cultural identity theft. Cultural identity theft is when you steal a people's story and you replace their story with a narrative of characterizing them as pimps and players and criminals and thugs, or people who are violent and disrespectful and not worthy of basic human rights. And so Dr. Amos Wilson, psychologist Dr. Amos Wilson, tells us that history is what creates a shared identity in a people. When we talk about cultural identity theft, we know that regular identity theft is when someone steals your personal information and uses that information to gain access to your resources and wealth. Well, again, cultural identity theft is when they steal a people's story and replace that story with a narrative of underachievement. So I asked the question, how do you take the people that gave the world reading and writing and language and literature, mathematics and medicine, architecture and engineering, agriculture and astronomy, science and technology? How do you take that group of people and yet convince them that they come from a race of pimps, players, criminals, and thugs? Cultural identity theft through curriculum violence. Yet another reason why we make the demand for reparations in education. Dr. Asa Hilliard tells us today, the formal education of most people of African ancestry is usually accomplished in systems that take us far away from ourselves. We don't see ourselves properly represented. We don't see our views and our values and our standpoints and perspectives represented in the curriculum. We don't see that in the teachers who are teaching and in the leaders who are supposedly leading. And this is deeply problematic. Amos Wilson asked the question, if there were not a direct relationship between history and money, history and power, history and rulership, history and domination, then why is it that the European rewrote history? And I would add to that, rewrote us out of history in such a way that we don't see ourselves properly represented in school curricula. Let me remind you, as I said earlier, Black people led the world in educational excellence, scientific innovation, literary production, and wealth creation. So now number six, the number six reason why we make the demand for reparations in education. Intentional access and opportunity gaps that lead to persistent achievement gaps. One more time, intentional access and opportunity gaps that lead to persistent achievement gaps. Now, when we say intentional, we're conveying intent because all of these things have been done intentionally. And when we consider what people call achievement gaps, they spread this information without giving proper context to what has happened to us as African people. So now we need to break down these terms because these terms have been used, once again, to mischaracterize Black students. Anytime you hear the term achievement gap, that is supposedly the gap in student achievement between Black students and white students. But if white students are performing at a mediocre level anyway, why would we want to compare our achievement to their achievement? No, what we should be comparing is current Black student achievement to Black excellence. Black excellence is the standard. And if there's a gap there, then we can look at how to close that gap. But what's causing and fueling the so-called achievement gap is access and opportunity gaps. The fact that Black children don't have access to high quality teachers, the fact that Black children tend not to have access to certified teachers, the fact that Black children don't tend to have access to teachers who are certified in their content area with a degree in that content area. The fact that Black children oftentimes don't have access to equitably funded schools, access and opportunity gaps. It is these access and opportunity gaps that lead to persistent achievement gaps. But if you only use the term achievement gap, that focuses the attention on the students and their supposed underachievement rather than on the systems and structures that produce underachievement intentionally. So don't fall for what Brother Anthony Muhammad, Dr. Anthony Muhammad calls the achievement gap trap. He has a book by the same title, Overcoming the Achievement Gap Trap, Liberating Mindsets to Effect Change. Number 7, well, before I get to number 7, let me share with you the achievement gap that very few people are talking about that Dr. Asa Hilliard illuminated for us in the book, Young, Gifted, and Black. And he has a chapter in there called No Mystery, Closing the Achievement Gap. It's the final chapter of the book. And in it, he talks about the achievement gap that few people are talking about, that when Black children and children of color, low-income children, have 3 good teachers in a row, good meaning culturally competent, when they have 3 good teachers in a row, according to evaluation research that he reviewed, when these children have 3 good teachers in a row, they outperform all other students, regardless of socioeconomic level and regardless of ethnic background. Very important. When our children have 3 good teachers in a row, they outperform all other students. Let me reiterate one more time. Those who say our children can't be reached have never seen a master teacher teach. What if our children get 3 good Black teachers in a row? Number 7, the 7th reason why we make the demand for reparations in education is because this system has created and cultivated a preschool to prison pipeline. This system has created and cultivated a preschool to prison pipeline. Dr. Amos Wilson tells us in The Falsification of African Consciousness, if you want to understand any problem in America, then you need to focus on who profits from that problem, not who suffers from the problem. So now we have to change our lens a little bit, because we've been focusing on Black children, and here's what's happened to Black children, and here's what's happened to Black teachers and leaders. But no, Dr. Wilson says, wait a minute, if you want to understand any problem in America, you need to focus on who profits from that problem, not who suffers from the problem. So when we pull back the curtain, when we pull back the layers to see what's going on in the prison industrial complex, and we see who profits from it, then it begins to become very, very clear why we're seeing some of the challenges that we do. Let's take a look at this article from Prison Legal News. Teachers' unions divest stock holdings in private prisons. Wait a minute. This is from April 2nd, 2019. In order for teachers' unions to divest or take their money out of stocks in prisons, that means they must have had their money in stocks in prisons. And so the article tells us that pension funds for teachers are abandoning their investment in private prisons. Can somebody tell me why the hell teachers' unions would be investing in prisons to begin with? That represents a serious problem. That's a serious conflict of interest, okay? And not only that, the article tells us that it was over $15 billion with a B. And we know that there's a disproportionate number of Black and brown children, Black and brown people in the prison industrial complex. We've looked at the work of Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow. We understand the preschool to prison pipeline, and we say preschool because it does in fact begin in preschool with documented empirical evidence, okay? So not only does this happen in K through 12 education teachers unions, and thankfully, yeah, they finally divested, but wait a minute, how long have these funds been invested in prisons? If they just divested last year in 2019, how long have these multi-millions and billions of dollars been invested in growing the prison industrial complex, which, by the way, is the largest and most expansive prison system in the world? But it's not just K through 12 teachers unions. The African Black Coalition in California broke the story that the University of California system of schools had invested $25 million in pension funds, endowment, and other funds in Corrections Corporation of America and the GEO Group, the 2 of the biggest private prison management companies in the nation. Again, this represents a direct and deeply problematic situation where you have a specific conflict of interest. Yet another reason why we make the demand for reparations in education. Now, brothers and sisters, those are just 7 things. I could expand that list probably to 100 different reasons why we make the demand for reparations in education. But I wanted to give those 7 just as a way of organizing and codifying in a brief list why we make the demand. But remember, we said at the beginning of this lecture, when you hear people talking about reparations, to talk about reparations isn't enough. You must have a plan for the demand. You don't want to leave that plan into the hands of those that perpetrated the crime, because they may tell you, well, we don't feel that you all deserve this, or we'll just give you this much. No, we need a plan that specifically outlines what we require. That plan right now is not complete. My goal is to gather a group of scholars to organize that plan and then to bring it into being. So what I'm going to share with you are some preliminary thoughts on what that plan should look like in the K through 12 educational realm, and then we'll look at higher education as well. Let's get into it. Recommendation number 1. I got 9 recommendations in this preliminary plan. There needs to be appropriations for Black people to build and maintain our own independent Black schools. Very important. When I say appropriations, I'm talking about money. Anytime you hear me talking about appropriations or see that on the screen, that's talking about money. There need to be specific monies set aside for Black people to build and maintain our own independent Black schools. Certainly, many of our people have already done this. This particular picture comes from Quilombo Pan-African Institute in Atlanta, Georgia, one of our great African-centered schools, in which we have several in the area. And there are a number of them around the country where Black people have organized and mobilized and are not waiting on reparations, but at the same time have run up against serious economic challenges to make this happen. And so we salute those that stood up in the midst of not having as many resources as they would have liked to have had. But we make the demand for reparations in education so that we can build and maintain our own independent Black schools. That is recommendation and demand number 1. In relation to that, recommendation and demand number 2 is that parents who desire to send their children to an independent Black school or to a home school would receive the proper funding to be able to do that. In other words, a lot of these independent Black schools, all of them to my knowledge, are tuition driven, which makes it very difficult for a number of people. Oftentimes the people who need it the most can't afford to send their children there. Black parents should not have to pay for their child to go to school. Black people should not have to pay anything in the form of tuition for their children to go to school. In a nation that denied education for hundreds of years, we should not have to pay anything. That should be part of the reparations package. And those independent Black educators and schools should be paid and paid well for the amazing work that they do in educating Black children. And so this demand for reparations in education would provide appropriations or money for parents who desire to send their children to an independent Black school or to homeschool their children on their own. Remember, Black children should be able to go to whatever school their parents desire for them to go to, whether that's a public school, private school, independent Black school, and should not have to pay not one dime, not one nickel, not 1 cent. But we also understand that appropriations should be made for us to build and maintain our own independent schools. Number three on our list of demands for reparations in education, we demand that parents who desire to send their child to an African-centered school or an independent Black school should have all the resources necessary to do just that. Okay, so as we continue with our list of demands for reparations in education, we're picking up with number 3, and that is this: that teachers, leaders, scholars, and community members must be granted appropriations, again, that's money, to develop curriculum resources. Listen, this has been a big part of the work that I do and have been doing for the past 25 years, literally developing books, workbooks, Black history and African proverb posters, videos and online curricula. But guess what? That takes time, that takes resources. And myself and many others like Tony Browder and Malefi Asante and So many other people have been involved in this work, but there need to be specific appropriations for teachers, leaders, scholars, and community members to be able to continue to develop these curriculum resources. And that is part of our demand for reparations in education as well, because that work takes a great deal of time where one has to be deeply invested to do the proper research to produce quality curriculum resources. And then that curricula has to be aligned to our standards, not other people's standards, but our standards. What are our standards as it relates to our children's education and their future? All of these things must be discussed, must be documented, must be researched, must be organized, must be formalized, must be published, must be marketed, must be disseminated. And that takes resources. And so there must be appropriations and funding for that. Next, number 4 on our list of demands for reparations in education. Though we would like for many of our children to go to independent Black schools so that they don't have to suffer the trauma of being alienated and isolated in schools where they are not significant in number, we want to also ensure that public schools infuse African and African American history and culture across the curriculum. Very important, not just in the social studies or history classroom, but across the curriculum, where they're taught the contributions and accomplishments of African and African American people. Now, this is important because there actually is a law that can serve as a precedent for that. Part of my doctoral research was examining state laws that dealt with teaching African American history. And in my review of those different laws, I found the law in the state of Florida to be the most comprehensive. Reason being, other state laws required that the history of enslavement be taught, or it required that African American history be taught starting in slavery, which is deeply problematic, or it just relegated it to the social studies classroom. No, we want it taught across the curriculum. And this is something that is mandated in Florida's African American history legislation, which was passed in 1994. But of course, teachers can't teach what they don't know. So I've done a good deal of consulting in Florida to help them become compliant with the law down there for those that are interested in making sure that they're in compliance. But the Florida law says that the African and African American contribution must be taught in all subject areas across the curriculum, not just social studies. So what is the African and African American contribution and accomplishments in science, in math, in language arts, in every single discipline, not even just the core disciplines of math, science, social studies, and language arts, but in all of the disciplines. We must insist and ensure that public schools do that, because remember, Black children can and should have the right to go to whatever school that their parents desire for them to go to. But we also want to be able to build and maintain independent Black schools. The next recommendation that we have, number 5, is that there must be annual appropriations, funding, money, to train a new generation of Black teachers, counselors, and administrators in African-centered and culturally responsive teaching methods, materials, content, leadership, and therapeutic approaches. That's a mouthful. Let me break that down for just a moment. We talked earlier about the fact that over 39,000 Black teachers and leaders were displaced as a result of the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. And that we also talked about the cumulative effect that has had over the decades since the Brown decision, which has led to a massive teacher shortage in general and a massive Black teacher shortage in particular, okay? But we don't just want Black teachers and leaders and counselors. We need to have properly trained Black teachers, leaders, and counselors. I say specifically in African-centered and culturally responsive methods, materials, and therapeutic approaches. So let me explain what I mean by African-centered. African-centered or Afrocentric education is centering ourselves and our children in the best of African culture. Many of our children have not been exposed to the best of our culture. Many of them have been exposed to the worst of our culture. So the first part is for them to be centered in the best of our culture, to examine and analyze information, meet needs, and solve problems in Black communities. But what happens for so many of our children is that they're not taught to meet needs and solve problems in our communities. They're taught how to meet needs and solve problems in other people's communities. So an African-centered education, a culturally responsive education, would center our children in the best of our culture to examine and analyze information, meet needs, and solve problems in our communities. What does that mean then as it relates to, for example, leaders? Well, there's a body of research literature as it relates to African-centered and culturally responsive leadership practices. They're African-centered and culturally responsive therapeutic approaches for school counselors. So for example, most school counselors, they're going to be exposed to the theories of Jean Piaget and Skinner and Freud and Carl Jung. Well, none of these people have raised one Black child, and none of these European psychologists and counselors and theorists have any experience with raising children in such oppressive circumstances. But we do have Black scholars who have expertise in that. We do have scholars like Linda James Myers, Dr. Linda James Myers. We do have scholars like Dr. Naeem Akbar. We do have scholars like Dr. Wade Nobles and Dr. Kevin Washington and Dr. Joy DeGruy, scholars who have made it their mission to develop therapeutic approaches and analytical skills that lead to being able to meet the therapeutic challenges that many of our children are facing. One of the challenges that they're facing is that we're dealing with multiple generations and intergenerational unaddressed trauma. Let me say that again. Multi-generational and intergenerational unaddressed trauma. Let me say that another way. We've been 400 years without therapy after experiencing the daily trauma of the Ma'afa, daily physical abuse, daily sexual abuse, daily neglect of basic medical care and all the different things, constantly traumatized and terrorized, and that got passed down from generation to generation. We need counselors, psychologists, and therapists who have been trained in African-centered and culturally responsive therapeutic modalities to be able to meet the needs of our children. We were dealing with this prior to COVID-19, prior to the racial uprisings of the year 2020. Can you imagine what we're going to be dealing with coming through and coming out of COVID-19 when we get back to face-to-face instruction? So now you see why we need to train a new generation of Black teachers, counselors, and administrators in African-centered and culturally responsive teaching methods, materials, content, leadership, and therapeutic approaches. Right, now, number 6, now we're moving into higher education. Higher education recommendations for our demand for reparations in education. The first thing that should happen in higher education, all student loans and student loan debt should be abolished, expunged, done away with. I still need to look at the legal language because I don't know if abolished or expunged would be the correct legal term. And this is why we need a large number of scholars to be able to make this claim, because legalese or legal language is very different than the language that you and I would normally use on a daily basis. But all student loans and student loan debt should be immediately abolished. Again, in a nation where our people have been denied education for centuries, no Black student should have to pay for their education, whether in K through 12 or in higher education. Some of you right now who are watching this right now are dealing with student loan debt. And that's a big problem. You have students coming out of school today who are coming out with six figures, 100,000, 200,000 plus dollars of student loan debt. That is absolutely unacceptable. And we make the demand that that be done away with. And then number 7, obviously, once student loans are done away with, tuition, college tuition, room and board for Black people should be absolutely free, from the undergraduate level to the master's degree level and to the doctoral level, should those students decide to persist to get their terminal degree, which is a doctoral degree. But whatever level they go in at, even at the junior college level, the community college level, the tuition should be absolutely free, along with room and board, right? And that leads us then to number 8. HBCUs should receive appropriations to hire faculty and improve and expand their infrastructure. Hiring the right faculty to meet the new demand of an influx of Black students, we know that there has been a surge, an uptick in Black students applying to and getting accepted to HBCUs for several reasons. Number one, many of their parents and many of the students themselves want to be in a culturally affirming environment where they're affirmed, rather than in being in an environment where they have to put up with all of the microaggressions and racist macroaggressions that come along with going to a PWI, or a predominantly white institution. We also know from the research literature that HBCUs have a history of bringing out the best and producing Black excellence. It's often been said that at PWIs, predominantly white institutions, the intelligence of Black students is called into question. Whereas at HBCUs, the intelligence of Black students is called into action. One more time, oftentimes at PWIs, the intelligence of Black students is called into question. Oh, you got here because of affirmative action, or you got here because of a special program. Your intelligence is being called into question, but at an HBCU, your intelligence is called into action. It's understood. Your intelligence, we're going to help to bring out your brilliance in the way that we provide educational services to you. So there must be appropriations for HBCUs to hire faculty, improve and expand their infrastructure. And improving and expanding their infrastructure may mean offering what is typically offered at the junior college and community college level, such as auto mechanics, HVAC, which is heating and air, welding, barbering and cosmetology. These are very, very important fields that need to be recognized and can be infused into HBCU infrastructures. But even if they're not infused in HBCU infrastructures, in the local community colleges. But HBCUs in particular need to gain access to additional funding to hire faculty and improve and expand infrastructure, because, watch this, HBCUs have never been properly funded to begin with. There are lawsuits out right now dealing with improper funding and inequitable funding of HBCUs. If you want to learn more about that, Google the Maryland HBCU lawsuit, where Morgan State and other HBCUs in the state of Maryland have a multi-million-dollar lawsuit going, dealing with inequitable funding, right? And then lastly, number 9. Now remember, there are many more demands that can and should be made. I tried to keep it to these 9, but this is not an exhaustive list. This is not a complete list. There's so much more that needs to be done. Numbers need to be added to this. When we talk about appropriations and additional funding, we need to be able to specify exactly how much funding. And I personally am not at that level yet, but I'm looking forward to continuing to doing that research and to bringing together a body of scholars to do that research. Number 9 is there needs to be appropriations for continuing research about reparations and its implementation to hold the government accountable. What does that mean? In the realm of policy development, when a policy or a law is implemented, there's something called fidelity of implementation. And what that means is when people examine it, they're examining it to see, did you do what the law was supposed to do? Did you do what the law was intended to do? Well, in order to do that, you have to have people in place to hold the government accountable. And in order to hold the government accountable, you need scholars who are actively involved in doing that research to say, hey, wait a minute, no, we were supposed to receive, I don't know, I'm just throwing a number out there, we were supposed to receive $10 billion for HBCUs to improve their infrastructure and to hire faculty, and only $1 billion has been released to do that. You need scholars who can do that research. That takes time and that takes resources. So recommendation and demand number 9 is for continuing research about reparations and its implementation to hold the government accountable. Now, brothers and sisters, as I begin to conclude, let me leave these few thoughts with you. There's an African proverb that says strategy is better than strength. Strategy is better than strength. We've heard about the demand for reparations for many years, and many of our great scholars have made a case for reparations, including Randall Robinson, who wrote the book, The Debt, right? What America Owes to Black People. And there are many others who have written about reparations, including Dr. Ray Winbush has written a book, an exhaustive book, where he invited other scholars to participate in that. But here's the thing. The general thoughts of Black people that I've talked to say, well, yeah, you know, we are due reparations, but I'm not standing by the mailbox waiting for a check. I get it, and neither am I. But understand, strategy is better than strength. With that in mind, Dr. William Darity and Kirsten Mullen have a new book out called From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And in it, he makes a very, very interesting point. Sometimes it's important to do the research to find out how other people got what they were advocating for. And we know that the Japanese Americans received reparations. We know that Native Americans received reparations. And certainly those reparations were due since they were put in internment camps during World War II. We know Native Americans should have received reparations, though they didn't get as much as they deserve. They did get some for attempted genocide and theft of their land. But we got to study what these different groups did to get reparations. Well, Darity and Mullen tell us that when Japanese Americans received reparations, this was accomplished by congressional, not judicial action. This is very important because Blacks have fought for reparations as it relates to the Rosewood Massacre in Florida, to the bombing and rioting in Tulsa, Oklahoma on Black Wall Street. But those quests for reparations were done through judicial means, taking it to court. But what Darity and Mullen are saying is that when Japanese Americans received reparations, it was accomplished by congressional, not judicial action. So man, you might be thinking now, wow, Congress, really? We're expecting Congress to do this? And the other thing that we oftentimes hear Black folks say is, they ain't gonna do that. They ain't gonna give y'all reparations. You ain't never gonna get that. Well, we're not asking anybody to give us anything. Number one, we're not asking. And number two, it's not giving. Number one, it's a demand. And it is a demand based on what our people have experienced. Not only that, it's not something that has not been granted to other groups. And it's something we must hold their feet to the fire on and never let them forget. No, we don't just want grants. No, we don't just want scholarships. No, we don't want ed reform. We want reparations, not reform, reparations. And so Darity and Mullen tell us also, for Black reparations to become a reality, a dramatic change in who serves as the nation's elected officials must take place, both in Congress and the White House. Now, you probably know where I'm going with this. We have a very important election coming up. Now, I want to be crystal clear with you and very, very upfront. I used to be that brother who used to say, man, I don't want to vote because I don't want to choose between the lesser of two evils. You know, who am I going to vote for, Satan or Lucifer? None of them really have our best interest at heart. Note taken. And my perspective in many regards has not changed on that. I'm not looking for, I don't expect an elected official to be a saint, and I don't expect an elected official to hold up the black power fist or to wave a red, black, and green flag. But here's what we do need to consider. That it was black elected officials who first raised H.R. 40, House Resolution 40, to address the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery. It was Representative John Conyers from Michigan who did that. And then after he retired, it was Representative Sheila Jackson Lee who carried on that struggle. We need elected officials in order to get the reparations claim demanded and appropriated. In terms of the legislative flow that is required, the law must be introduced, then it must pass the House of Representatives, then it must pass the Senate, then it has to go through the president, and then it becomes a law. Well, guess what? House Resolution 40, which was just to study reparations, it was only introduced. That's why it's in green. But it hasn't passed the House, hasn't passed the Senate, hasn't passed the president, and it's certainly not a law yet. And so what I want you to consider is the words of Kazembe Ajamu. Baba Kazembe Ajamu, who's also known as the urban politician. He is the founder of the Black Dot Cultural Center in the Atlanta metropolitan area in Lithonia, Georgia. He says, we're not voting for the lesser of two evils, but for the path of least resistance. Powerful people get their demands met regardless of who is in office. But remember, there's an African proverb that says strategy is better than strength. So let me go back here to show you, remember, for Black Americans, for Black reparations to become a reality, a dramatic change in who serves as the nation's elected officials must take place both in Congress and in the White House. We need to show up and we need to show out in all elections. We are oftentimes the deciding factor. And I'll leave you with this. I am very clear that voting is not the end all and be all of everything that it will take for us to achieve what we need to achieve as a people. It's not everything, but it is something. And so I want to encourage and admonish you to take these things into consideration as it relates to the upcoming elections. Brothers and sisters, I want to leave you with this African proverb that says, if you desire to move mountains tomorrow, you must first begin by moving small stones today. What I've shared with you today in terms of this outline for education, for reparations, a plan for the demand, this just represents some of the small stones that we must begin moving today in order to move mountains tomorrow. My name is Dr. Chike Akua, and I approve this message. I invite you to continue the conversation, and I want to give a very, very special thanks once again to the Auburn Avenue Research Library. Peace and blessings.